Would you say there are differences in pathways and styles across certain populations? And if there are, could you describe them for us?
I wish I could describe them in more detail, Phil. We've done a tremendous amount of research on how do things like gender, how do things like age, how do things like co-occurring disorders, medical or psychiatric, how do alcohol and other drug problems differ within different cultural contexts. But when we shift that to recovery and ask the questions, are there different styles or patterns of recovery for women than men? Are there differences of recovery when onset is it 15 years of age as opposed to 45 or 55 or 75? Is there differences based on, are there different patterns we find of recovery within the LGBT community? Do we have differences of recovery for people with co-occurring disorders, et cetera? We're just beginning to map those out. And so far, I think the preliminary answers we have are yes, there seem to be significant differences across those, but our answers to those are very tentative. And what that, I think, calls for is a very high degree of humility, that when we talk about what we know about recovery, we must be very specific in terms of what our experience is based on to date, and keep those ideas on probation, because they may differ as we apply them to different subpopulations and different cultural communities.
How does the factor of trauma play into this?
It's in that same context. We know that trauma can have a significant effect on increasing vulnerability for substance use disorders. But we also find that there are differences across traumatized population, whether we're talking about historical trauma or developmental trauma. And for example, in the area of developmental trauma, we know people are at significantly elevated risk if they're based on unique characteristics of that trauma, meaning the intensity, the types of trauma experienced, the duration of it, who the particular perpetrators were in the relationship to the perpetrators, what happened if the person disclosed or shared the story of that trauma, and then what the response was to that disclosure. Those are examples of things that shift in terms of vulnerability. What we're not sure of is we haven't done the studies to know how does recovery differ when you're also recovering from trauma in addition to recovering from an addictive disorder. And this, as we've begun to look at this, it really has raised the question for us about this issue of what we've called concurrent recovery or sequential or serial recovery, meaning people that are recovering from multiple conditions doing so at the same time, meaning they're having to adjust and manage multiple recovery experiences at the same time, such as recovery from addiction and recovery in terms of HIV or AIDS, or recovery from trauma, or recovery from depression at the same time. Or some individuals who in their recovery experience may almost have to sequence, where there's a focus on one particular dimension of recovery that then may shift to another dimension of recovery over time. Meaning that my first initial focus may be on stabilizing the addiction, but once that's stabilized, the next layer of that onion may be the trauma that sat underneath that addiction.